The sun hung low over the Eaglestone construction site, a sprawling maze of steel beams, concrete slabs, and dust clouds that clung to everything like a second skin. It was 7:45 a.m., and the air already carried the weight of a late summer day in Atlanta, thick with humidity and the sharp tang of diesel. The site buzzed with the rhythm of industry cranes groaning, drills shrieking, and the low hum of workers shouting over the noise. This was no ordinary project. Eaglestone Tower was set to be a 30-story monument in the heart of the financial district, a glass and steel giant that would redefine the city's skyline. But beneath the ambition, something was rotting in the foundation, and not just the one buried in the earth. Malik Thompson, 39, moved through the chaos with the ease of someone who'd spent half his life on sites like this. His work boots, caked with dried cement, left faint prints on the packed dirt as he adjusted the settings on a concrete mixer. His dark skin glistened with sweat under a faded navy jacket, the kind you'd find in any hardware store for $15. To the untrained eye, he was just another laborer, one of the dozens who hauled rebar, mixed mortar, and kept the machine of progress grinding. But his eyes, sharp, steady, and carrying a quiet weight, told a different story. They scanned the mixer's gauges with the precision of an engineer, noting a slight irregularity in the rotation speed. His rough hands, calloused from years of labor, turned the dial just enough to stabilize the flow. The machine settled into a smoother hum, and Malik stepped back, wiping his brow with a rag from his pocket. "Thompson!" a voice barked, cutting through the din like a blade. Malik turned, his expression calm but alert. Striding toward him was Ethan Caldwell, 43, the chief engineer of the Eaglestone project. Ethan was everything the site's hierarchy revered. Tall, lean, with a Stanford master's degree framed in his office and a reputation for delivering projects under budget. His crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, stood out against the grime of the site, a deliberate signal of his status. His blonde hair was neatly combed, and his blue eyes carried a glint of impatience as he closed the distance. Behind him trailed Jared, his assistant, clutching a tablet and struggling to keep up. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Ethan snapped, stopping a few feet from Malik. His voice was loud enough to draw workers' pause mid-task, their glances flickering between the two men. "You don't touch the equipment without clearance. You're not a mechanic." Malik tucked the rag into his pocket, his movements deliberate. "The mixer was off," he said, his voice low but clear, with a faint southern drawl that grounded him in the moment. "The rotation was uneven. It would have jammed in 10 minutes, maybe less. I fixed it." Ethan's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching under his clean-shaven cheek. "Fixed it?" he repeated, his tone dripping with condescension. "You're paid to pour cement, Thompson, not play engineer. Leave the machines to the professionals." A few workers nearby exchanged looks. Tyrell, a burly machinist with a shaved head and a scar across his left eyebrow, leaned against a stack of rebar, his arms crossed. He'd seen this before, Ethan's need to assert dominance, especially when someone stepped out of their place. Rosa, the petite warehouse supervisor, hovered near a pallet of cement bags, her lips pressed into a thin line. She liked Malik. He was quiet, respectful, and always seemed to know more than he let on. But she knew better than to speak up when Ethan was on a roll. Malik held Ethan's gaze, unflinching. "With respect, Mr. Caldwell," he said, choosing his words carefully, "a jam would have cost us an hour of downtime. I've seen it happen before. The fix was simple." Ethan took a step closer, his polished shoes kicking up a puff of dust. "Simple?" he scoffed, loud enough for the growing crowd to hear. "You think you're smarter than the techs we pay 6 figures to? Stick to your job, Thompson. Or do I need to remind you who's in charge here?" The air thickened with tension. The worker's silence wasn't just deference, it was the kind of quiet that came from years of knowing when to keep your head down. Malik's throat tightened, not from fear, but from a familiar anger, the kind that simmered when you were reduced to a stereotype. He'd felt it before, decades ago, as a young black laborer on sites where his ideas were dismissed before they left his mouth. But he wasn't that 19-year-old kid anymore. He was something else entirely, and Ethan Caldwell was about to learn that the hard way. "I hear you," Malik said, his voice steady, almost too calm. "Just trying to keep things moving." Ethan smirked, sensing victory. "Good. Now get back to work. We're behind schedule as it is." He turned to Jared, who was tapping nervously at his tablet. "Make a note, Thompson's on thin ice. One more stunt like this and he's out." Jared hesitated, his eyes darting to Malik. "Ah yes, sir," he mumbled, typing quickly. The crowd began to disperse, the moment seemingly over. But Tyrell lingered, his gaze locked on Malik as if he sensed something bigger brewing beneath the surface. Malik returned to his post, grabbing a shovel and joining the crew pouring concrete for the foundation's northeast corner. The work was grueling, the kind that left your back screaming by noon, but Malik moved with purpose. As he shoveled, his mind wasn't on Ethan's words, it was on the foundation itself. He'd noticed something during yesterday's pour. The ground sloped more than the blueprints accounted for. It wasn't a glaring error, but enough to cause misalignment stress over time. Uneven settlement was a silent killer in construction, the kind of flaw that could bring a skyscraper to its knees years after the ribbon was cut. He'd planned to raise it at the morning meeting, but Ethan's outburst had just made that harder. The morning wore on, the sun climbing higher, baking the site in a relentless haze. By 10:15, the crew was setting up scaffolding for the next phase of the foundation work. Luis, a 22-year-old mason with a quick smile and a habit of humming reggaeton under his breath, was hauling planks up the scaffold. He was new, eager to prove himself, but still learning the rhythms of the site. Malik watched him from below, his eyes narrowing as he noticed a faint tremor in the structure. The scaffold was anchored to the northeast corner, the same area he'd flagged in his mind. "Luis," Malik called, his voice sharp but not panicked. "Hold up a second." Luis paused, balancing a plank on his shoulder. "What's up, man?" he asked, wiping sweat from his brow. Malik didn't answer right away. He crouched, inspecting the base of the scaffold where it met the freshly poured concrete. The ground beneath felt soft, too yielding for a foundation that was supposed to be rock solid. His fingers brushed the surface and he frowned. The slope was off, just as he'd suspected. The concrete hadn't settled evenly, and the scaffold's weight was stressing the weak point. Before he could say more, a low groan echoed from the structure. The scaffold swayed, a slow, sickening motion that sent a jolt through Malik's chest. Luis stumbled, the plank slipping from his hands and clattering to the ground. Workers shouted, scrambling back as the scaffold tilted further, its metal frame creaking under the strain. "Luis, get down!" Malik roared, sprinting toward the base. He grabbed the ladder, climbing with a speed that belied his years of labor. Luis froze, gripping the railing as the scaffold lurched again. Below, Tyrell and Rosa rushed forward, yelling for others to clear the area. Dust billowed as the concrete slab beneath the scaffold cracked, a hairline fracture spiderwebbing across the surface. Malik reached Luis just as the scaffold tipped dangerously to one side. He grabbed the young man's arm, pulling him onto the ladder. "Move now," he ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos. Luis scrambled down, his breath ragged, and Malik followed, jumping the last few feet to the ground. The scaffold didn't collapse, but it leaned precariously, a silent warning of what could have been. The crew erupted in a mix of curses and relieved chatter. Luis, pale and shaking, leaned against a stack of cinder blocks. "Man, I thought I was done," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "Thanks, Malik." Malik nodded, his eyes still on the cracked slab. "You good?" he asked, clapping Luis on the shoulder. Yeah, I'm good," Luis said, forcing a grin. "Oh, you won, man." Tyrell jogged over, his face a mix of anger and concern. "What the hell was that?" he demanded, gesturing at the scaffold. "That thing's supposed to be stable. We poured that slab 2 days ago." Before Malik could respond, Ethan's voice cut through the crowd. "What's going on here?" He stormed toward them, his face flushed with irritation. Jared trailed behind, looking more anxious than ever. The workers parted, their chatter dying down as Ethan surveyed the scene. His eyes landed on the leaning scaffold, then the cracked concrete, and finally on Malik and Luis. "Somebody better explain this," Ethan said, his tone sharp enough to slice through steel. "We're on a deadline, and I'm not dealing with another delay because of sloppy work." Luis shrank back, his earlier bravado gone. Malik stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "The foundation's off," he said, pointing to the crack. "The northeast corner's got a slope the blueprints didn't account for. The scaffold's weight stressed it, and it gave. If we don't reinforce it, we're looking at bigger problems." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "You're telling me how to read my own blueprints now," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "This is a multi-million-dollar project, Thompson. We've got engineers with degrees checking every inch of this site. You think you know better than them?" The crowd was silent now, the weight of Ethan's words hanging heavy. Malik didn't flinch. I'm saying what I see, he replied. That crack's not a fluke. The slope's causing uneven settlement. If we keep building on it, this whole section could fail. Ethan laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. Fail, he repeated, turning to the crowd as if performing for an audience. Listen to this guy. A laborer with a high school diploma thinks he's gonna save the day. Maybe we should give him a hard hat with Chief Engineer written on it. A few workers chuckled nervously, but most stayed quiet. Tyrell's fists clenched at his sides and Rosa shot Malik a sympathetic glance. Jared stared at his tablet, avoiding eye contact. Ethan stepped closer to Malik, his voice dropping to a mocking whisper. You want to play hero? Fine. But you're not touching my project. Get back to your shovel before you make things worse. Malik's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He knew this game had played it on a dozen sites before he became the man he was now. The anger was there, coiled tight in his chest, but he'd learned long ago to channel it, to wait for the right moment. He gave Ethan a slight nod, then turned back to the crew. Let's secure the scaffold, he said, his voice calm but firm. No one goes up until it's stable. Ethan opened his mouth to object, but a shout from the site supervisor, Henry Brooks, interrupted him. He's right, Henry said, striding over. At 56, Henry was a veteran of the industry, his weathered face and graying hair a testament to decades on sites like this. That scaffold's a hazard. We're locking it down until we check the foundation. Ethan's face reddened, but he didn't argue with Henry. The older man's authority carried weight, even if Ethan outranked him on paper. Fine, Ethan snapped. But this better not push us back. And Thompson, you're on notice. One more step out of line and you're gone. Malik didn't reply. He grabbed a coil of rope and joined Tyrell and Luis to stabilize the scaffold, his movements precise despite the adrenaline still coursing through him. As the crew worked, whispers spread. Malik saved Luis's ass, one worker muttered. Ethan's gonna regret messing with him, another said, low enough not to be overheard. Henry watched from a distance, his eyes lingering on Malik. He'd seen something in the younger man from the day he started 4 weeks ago, a quiet confidence, a knack for spotting problems others missed. Henry had worked for Eaglestone since its early days, back when the company was just a dream in the mind of a man named Thomas Hayes. He didn't know Malik's full story, but he sensed there was more to him than a laborer's jacket and a beat-up Nokia phone. By 11 a.m., the scaffold was secured, and the crew was back to pouring concrete. Malik worked alongside them, his mind racing. The crack in the foundation wasn't just a technical flaw, it was a symptom of something deeper. A culture where warnings were ignored, and workers were silenced. He'd come to this site for a reason, not as Malik Thompson, but as Thomas Malik Thompson Hayes, the founder and CEO of Eaglestone Constructions. For years, he disguised himself as a laborer to see his company through the eyes of those at the bottom, to root out the arrogance and negligence that could topple an empire. Today he'd seen enough. As the lunch whistle sounded, Malik pulled his Nokia from his pocket, its scratched screen glowing faintly in the sunlight. He typed a quick message, just 11 characters. KT3P15, call back. He hit send, then slipped the phone away, his face betraying nothing. Ethan Caldwell thought he'd won this round, but the real game was just beginning. The foundation of Eaglestone Tower wasn't the only thing about to crack. The makeshift meeting room at the Eaglestone construction site was a steel wall trailer parked on the edge of the dusty lot, its air conditioning rattling like a dying engine. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of coffee, sweat, and the faint chemical tang of blueprint ink. It was just past 11:30 a.m., and the Atlanta sun streamed through a cracked window, casting jagged shadows across the folding table at the room's center. A dozen men and women engineers, supervisors, and a handful of senior workers sat in metal chairs, their faces a mix of boredom and unease. At the head of the table stood Ethan Caldwell, the 43-year-old chief engineer, his crisp white shirt now slightly wilted from the morning's heat. He held a laser pointer, its red dot dancing across a projected blueprint of Eaglestone Tower's foundation, his voice sharp and commanding as he outlined the week's schedule. We're 3 days behind, Ethan said, his blue eyes scanning the room with the intensity of a hawk. The northeast corner needs to be locked in by Friday, or we're looking at a $200,000 penalty from the client. No excuses, no delays. Understood. Nods rippled through the group, though most were half-hearted. Jared, Ethan's assistant, sat to his right, furiously typing notes on his tablet, his glasses slipping down his nose. Daniel Harper, the 50-year-old senior structural engineer, leaned back in his chair, his graying beard framing a frown. He'd been with Eaglestone for 2 decades, and his silence carried the weight of someone who'd seen too many corners cut to believe in Ethan's bravado. Across from him, Rosa, the warehouse supervisor, doodled on her notepad, her dark hair pulled into a tight bun. She was here to report on material shortages, but her mind kept drifting to the morning's near accident with the scaffold and Malik Thompson's quick thinking that saved Louise. Malik sat at the far end of the table, his navy jacket draped over the back of his chair. His work boots were still caked with cement dust, and his hands rested calmly on a rolled-up blueprint, its edges worn from use. At 39, he carried himself with a quiet authority that didn't demand attention but earned it anyway. His dark eyes moved from the projected blueprint to Ethan, reading the chief engineer's every gesture. Malik had been on the site for 4 weeks, long enough to see the cracks in Ethan's leadership, literal and figurative. The Northeast Foundation was a problem, and he wasn't about to let it slide, no matter how many times Ethan tried to silence him. Ethan clicked to the next slide, a timeline graph glowing on the screen. "We're pushing the concrete pour to tomorrow," he said. "The client's coming for a walkthrough next week, and I want that section looking flawless. Any questions?" The room stayed quiet, the kind of silence that clung to a group too wary to challenge the boss. Ethan's lips curved into a satisfied smirk, but it faltered when Malik cleared his throat. Heads turned, chairs creaking as eyes settled on the laborer at the end of the table. Ethan's smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "Thompson," Ethan said, his voice laced with mockery. "You got something to say? Or are you just here to take up space?" Malik unrolled his blueprint, smoothing it with deliberate care. His voice was steady, almost soft, but it carried a weight that filled the room. "With respect, Mr. Caldwell, the Northeast Corners Foundation isn't ready for another pour. The slope of the terrain's off by at least 3 degrees. If we don't reinforce it, the stress will cause uneven settlement. We saw it this morning with the scaffold crack." The room went still. Jared's fingers froze on his tablet, and Rose's pen stopped mid-doodle. Daniel Harper leaned forward, his frown deepening as he glanced at the blueprint on the screen. Tyrell, sitting near the door, crossed his arms, his scar catching the light as he watched Ethan's reaction. The chief engineer's face reddened, his laser pointer trembling slightly in his hand. "You're analyzing my foundation now?" Ethan said, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. "A laborer who thinks he's an engineer because he can read a blueprint? That's rich." A few nervous chuckles broke the silence, mostly from younger engineers eager to stay on Ethan's good side. Aaron Langley, the foundation inspection supervisor, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting to Malik. He'd flagged the same issue in an email last week, but Ethan had brushed it off, saying it was within tolerance. Now Aaron's silence felt like a betrayal, and he hated himself for it. Malik didn't flinch. "I'm not claiming to be an engineer," he said, his southern drawl grounding his words. "But I've been on enough sites to know what a bad foundation looks like. That crack wasn't random. If we pour tomorrow, we're asking for trouble." Ethan stepped away from the projector, his polished shoes clicking on the trailer's linoleum floor. He leaned forward, planting both hands on the table, his eyes locked on Malik. "Let me make this clear," he said, his voice low and venomous. "We don't pay you to think, Thompson. We pay you to follow orders. My team's got Stanford degrees, MIT certifications, and decades of experience. You've got WADA high school diploma and a shovel." The room sucked in a collective breath. Rose's pen snapped in her hand, a tiny crack that echoed in the silence. Tyrell's fists clenched, and Daniel Harper's jaw tightened, his fingers tapping a slow rhythm on his notebook. Malik's expression didn't change, but his eyes held Ethan's with a calm that was almost unnerving. It wasn't defiance, it was certainty, the kind that made Ethan's confidence waver for a split second. "You're right," Malik said, his voice even. "I don't have a degree, but I've seen buildings fall because someone ignored a warning. I'm just asking you to double-check the slope before we move forward." Ethan straightened, his smirk returning, though it was tighter now, less assured. "Double-check?" he repeated, turning to the room as if inviting them to share in the absurdity. "Did you hear that, folks? Our resident hero wants me to halt a multi-million-dollar project because he's got a hunch. Maybe I should hand him my job while I'm at it." The forced laughter came again, but it was thinner, more strained. Aaron Langley stared at his hands, guilt gnawing at him. Rose's eyes flicked to Malik, a silent apology in her gaze. Daniel Harper cleared his throat, and for a moment it seemed he might speak, but he leaned back, his silence a choice he'd regret later. Ethan pointed his laser at Malik, the red dot landing on the blueprint in front of him. "This is why we have management," he said, his voice rising. "So people like me make the decisions and people like you follow. You're out of your depth, Thompson. Stick to your lane, or you'll be out of a job by sundown." The threat hung in the air, heavy as the humidity outside. Malik's fingers tightened on the blueprint, but his face remained impassive. He'd heard worse in his career insights where his skin color was reason enough to dismiss him, where his voice was drowned out by men like Ethan who saw titles as armor. But this wasn't about pride. It was about a foundation that could kill if ignored, about a company he'd built from nothing, and about a truth he was here to uncover. "I understand," Malik said, folding the blueprint with a slow, deliberate motion. "Just thought it was worth mentioning." Ethan clapped twice, a theatrical gesture that felt like a curtain dropping on a one-man show. "Thank you, Engineer Thompson, for your invaluable input," he said, his sarcasm slicing through the room. "Now let's get back to reality. We're accelerating the pour to tomorrow morning. No delays, no personal crusades. Clear?" The room murmured agreement, though it was more compliance than conviction. Ethan turned back to the projector, clicking to a new slide, his confidence restored. "Jared, pull up the material logs. We need to." Malik's chair scraped softly as he stood, drawing every eye in the room. He didn't say a word, just slipped his jacket over his shoulder and pulled a battered Nokia phone from his pocket. The device was a relic, its scratched screen and worn keypad a stark contrast to the sleek smartphones on the table. Ethan glanced over, his brow furrowing. "Something more to add, Thompson?" he asked, his tone mocking but edged with unease. Malik shook his head. "No, sir," he said, his voice calm. "Just need to step out for a minute." Ethan snorted. "Don't wander too far. We're not done here." Malik nodded, his expression unreadable, and slipped out the trailer door. The midday sun hit him like a wall, the heat pressing against his skin as he stepped onto the cement-dusted pathway. His boots made a steady crunch with each step, but his mind was elsewhere. He glanced at the Nokia, its screen glowing faintly with the message he'd typed moments before. KT3P15, call back. 11 characters sent in 6 seconds, but they carried the weight of a seismic shift. He pressed send, then tucked the phone away, his eyes lifting to the skeleton of Eaglestone Tower rising against the skyline. Inside the trailer, Ethan continued his monologue, oblivious to the fault line he'd just widened. "The client's expecting progress," he said, pointing at the timeline. "We're not letting some laborer's paranoia derail us. Harper, you're overseeing the pour tomorrow. Make sure it's clean." Daniel Harper nodded, but his eyes lingered on the door where Malik had exited. He'd worked with men like Malik before, quiet, observant, the kind who saw what others missed. Something about the laborer's calm unnerved him, like a storm gathering on a clear day. Rosa too felt it. She scribbled a note on her pad. "Check northeast slope." She didn't know why, but Malik's warning had lodged in her mind like a splinter. Outside, Malik leaned against a stack of rebar, the metal warm under his hands. The site buzzed around him, cranes swinging, workers shouting, the relentless pulse of construction. But his focus was inward, on the company he'd founded 2 decades ago, on the values he poured into it like concrete into a mold. Eaglestone wasn't just a name, it was a promise, a commitment to build not just towers but trust. Somewhere along the way, that promise had cracked, and men like Ethan Caldwell were the reason why. He thought back to his first site at 19, when a foreman had laughed at his suggestion to adjust a beam's alignment. "Stick to sweeping, kid," the man had said, and Malik had swallowed the insult, vowing to prove him wrong. He'd clawed his way up, not with degrees but with grit, learning every bolt, every pour, every blueprint until he could outthink the men who dismissed him. Now, as Thomas Malik Thompson Hayes, he was here to test his company's foundation, to see if it still held true. Today he'd seen enough. The trailer door swung open and Tyrell stepped out, his face a mask of frustration. "Man, that was some bull," he said, keeping his voice low. "Caldwell's got no right talking to you like that. You saved Luis this morning, and he's acting like you're the problem." Malik gave a slight nod. "He's just doing what he knows," he said, his tone even. "Doesn't make it right." Tyrell shook his head, his scar catching the sunlight. "You should have called him out. Guy like that needs to be put in his place." Malik's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Sometimes silence says more than words," he said. "Trust me, Tyrell. This ain't over." Tyrell studied him, sensing the weight behind the words. "You got a plan, don't you?" he asked, his voice half curious, half skeptical. Malik didn't answer, just clapped Tyrell on the shoulder. "Go eat lunch," he said. "I'll see you at the next shift." As Tyrell walked off, Malik's phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out, the screen flashing a single word, "Confirmed." His eyes narrowed, a faint spark of resolve igniting in them. Ethan Caldwell thought he'd won this round, thought he'd silenced the laborer who dared to speak. But the meeting wasn't the end, it was the spark. And the fire was coming. The Eaglestone construction site was a furnace under the midday Atlanta sun, the heat pressing down like a physical weight on the workers scattered across the lot. Inside the administrative trailer, the air conditioning wheezed, barely keeping the stifling warmth at bay. The steel walls of the trailer seemed to close in as Ethan Caldwell, the 43-year-old chief engineer, stood in the doorway, his polished shoes gleaming against the dusty linoleum. His phone buzzed in his hand, the screen glowing with a message that stopped his heart. Urgent. Chairman Thomas M. Hayes arriving in 15 minutes for unannounced inspection. All management to assemble. Ethan's blue eyes widened, his fingers tightening around the phone as if it might burn him. Thomas M. Hayes, the founder of Eaglestone Constructions, a name spoken in whispers, a legend who hadn't set foot on a site in 5 years. The last time he'd shown up unannounced, a project manager was fired on the spot for a structural miscalculation. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dried despite the half-empty coffee cup on his desk. "Jared," he barked, his voice sharp enough to make his assistant jump. Jared, a lanky 20-something with glasses perpetually sliding down his nose, scrambled to his feet, clutching his tablet. "Get the engineering team in here. Check every drawing, every report. Clean up the meeting area. Move." Jared's eyes darted to the phone in Ethan's hand, the message still glowing. "The chairman's really coming?" he asked, his voice trembling. Ethan didn't answer. He shoved the phone into his pocket and strode to the trailer's window, peering out at the site. Cranes swung lazily, workers hauled rebar, and the skeleton of Eaglestone Tower loomed against the skyline. Everything looked normal, but the air felt charged like the moment before a storm breaks. Ethan's mind raced. He'd spent years building his reputation, Stanford degree, flawless project record, bonuses that paid for his Buckhead condo. He wasn't about to let a surprise inspection derail him. Not now, not when the client was days away from a walkthrough. Outside, the site hummed with its usual chaos, but a ripple of unease was spreading. Workers whispered about the morning's scaffold incident, about Malik Thompson's warning, and about Ethan's public humiliation of the quiet laborer. Malik, 39, stood in the workers' parking lot, unnoticed by the frenzy inside the trailer. His silver sedan, a modest relic from the early 2000s, sat unassuming among the pickup trucks and dusty SUVs. He opened the trunk, revealing a dark brown leather briefcase tucked beneath his worn navy jacket. Inside the briefcase were neatly folded clothes, a crisp white shirt, a dark blue suit, and a pair of silver-rimmed glasses in a velvet case. Malik's movements were unhurried, precise as he shed his cement-stained work clothes and transformed. The jacket came off, replaced by the suit. The glasses settled on his nose, sharpening his already piercing gaze. He fastened a watch to his wrist, its understated steel catching the sunlight. When he closed the trunk and turned, the man in the rearview mirror was no longer Malik Thompson, the laborer. He was Thomas Malik Thompson Hayes, founder and CEO of Eaglestone Constructions, a man who carried the weight of a company on his shoulders and the resolve to tear down anything that betrayed its foundation. Back in the trailer, Ethan was a whirlwind of nervous energy. "Harper," he snapped at Daniel Harper, the 50-year-old senior structural engineer, who was flipping through a stack of foundation reports. "Make sure the northeast corner data is clean. No discrepancies, you hear me?" Daniel's graying beard twitched as he nodded, but his eyes were troubled. He'd seen Malik's blueprint in the meeting, heard his warning about the slope. It wasn't just a hunch. Daniel had run the numbers himself last week and found a 3-degree misalignment. Rosa, the warehouse supervisor, was reorganizing material logs at the back of the trailer, her hands moving faster than her thoughts. She couldn't shake Malik's words from the meeting, the way he'd stood his ground despite Ethan's venom. She'd worked with men like Ethan before, men who saw her as just a Latina woman in a man's world, her voice dismissed until it suited them. Malik was different, and it gnawed her that she hadn't backed him up. 14 minutes later, a sleek black Mercedes rolled through the site's main gate, its tires crunching softly on the gravel. No sirens, no fanfare, just a quiet presence that silenced the workers nearby. Ethan stood outside the gate, his tie straightened, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. He'd rehearsed his greeting, a modest smile, a firm handshake, a scripted line about the project's progress. Jared hovered behind him, tablet in hand, while Daniel and the engineering team formed a nervous line. The workers, sensing something big, paused their tasks, their eyes drawn to the car. The driver's door opened, and a tall man in a black suit stepped out, his posture rigid, clearly security. Then the rear door swung open, and out stepped a figure in a dark blue suit, silver-rimmed glasses glinting in the sun. Ethan's smile froze. His breath caught in his throat as the man approached. Each step deliberate, his presence commanding the air like a general entering a battlefield. It wasn't just any chairman. It was Malik Thompson, or rather, Thomas Malik Thompson Hayes. Ethan's knees buckled, but he caught himself, his face paling as if the blood had been drained from his body. "Excuse me," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "We were expecting Mr. Thomas M. Hayes." Thomas extended a hand, his expression calm but his eyes sharp as a blade. "Thomas Malik Thompson Hayes," he said, his voice clear, resonant, each word a hammer strike. "A pleasure to meet you again, Engineer Caldwell." The world tilted. Jared's tablet slipped from his hands, clattering to the ground. Daniel Harper's mouth fell open, his notebook forgotten. Rosa, standing at the edge of the crowd, gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Workers whispered, their voices a low buzz, "That's Malik." "The laborer?" "No way, man, that's the chairman?" Tyrell, leaning against a stack of rebar, let out a low whistle, his scar twitching as he grinned. Ethan took a step back, blinking as if he could will the moment away. But Thomas's hand was still extended, and the weight of his gaze was inescapable. "Two don't understand," Ethan managed, his voice cracking. He took the offered handshake, his palm clammy against Thomas's steady grip. "You're the one The one you told to stick to his shovel?" Thomas finished, his tone even but cutting. "The one you said wasn't paid to think?" "Yes, that's me. And I'm here to see how this site is really run." The crowd was silent now, the only sound the distant hum of a crane. Ethan's face was a mask of shock, his confident smirk shattered like glass. Thomas released his hand and stepped past him, addressing the gathered team. "Let's move to the main trailer," he said. "We have work to do." Inside the trailer, the atmosphere was electric, the air thick with anticipation and dread. Thomas stood at the head of the table, his suit impeccable, his glasses catching the fluorescent light. The engineering team sat in stunned silence, their reports and blueprints spread before them like evidence in a trial. Ethan hovered near the projector, his hands trembling as he tried to regain control. Jared scrambled to pick up his tablet, his glasses fogging with sweat. Daniel Harper stared at Thomas, a mix of awe and guilt in his eyes. Rosa clutched her notepad, her heart pounding as she realized the man she'd admired was the one who'd built Eaglestone from the ground up. Thomas placed his briefcase on the table, snapping it open with a sound that echoed like a gavel. He pulled out a thick folder marked Internal Audit and set it down, his movements deliberate. 3 weeks ago, he began, his voice steady, I commissioned a full review of this project's technical records. Today we're going to discuss the findings. Ethan's stomach dropped. He opened his mouth to speak, but Thomas raised a hand, silencing him. Before we start, Thomas said, let me address the obvious. You thought I was just a laborer, Mr. Caldwell. You thought my warning about the Northeast Foundation was what, paranoia? A hunch? Let's see what the data says. He nodded to a woman in a gray suit who'd entered with him, one of the auditors. She connected a laptop to the projector, and the screen lit up with charts, graphs, and red-marked documents. The room held its breath as the first slide appeared. Summary of Violations Eaglestone Tower Project. The number at the top was stark. 17 serious technical violations. Murmurs rippled through the room. Daniel Harper leaned forward, his eyes scanning the screen. Rosa's pen trembled in her hand. Ethan's face was ashen, his tie suddenly too tight around his neck. The auditor stepped forward, her voice clinical. The findings include 4 falsified foundation inspection reports, the use of C-grade steel instead of C-grade, 3 unapproved structural changes, and 2 instances of deleted crack reports from the risk management system. The final approver for all changes was the chief engineer, Ethan Caldwell. All eyes turned to Ethan. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. This is exaggerated, he blurted, his voice rising in desperation. This is a witch hunt. You can't pin this on me. The schedule was tight, the client was breathing down our necks. Enough, Thomas said, his voice low but commanding. He opened the folder, pulling out a stack of printed emails. These are your responses to warnings from your team. Mr. Harper flagged the northeast slope last week. Mr. Langley reported steel compression discrepancies. Both were dismissed. You signed off on every change, every falsified report. Do you deny it? Ethan's mouth opened, then closed. He looked at Daniel, then Aaron, but both men avoided his gaze. Daniel's guilt was written in the lines of his face. Should have pushed harder. Should have gone over Ethan's head. Aaron stared at his hands, remembering the altered report he'd seen but hadn't challenged. The silence was deafening, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning. I can explain, Ethan said, his voice fracturing. The rain delayed us. The budget was overrun. I made judgment calls to keep us on track. The steel was fine, the supplier guaranteed it. Thomas's eyes narrowed, his glasses glinting. You cut inspections to save time, he said. You used substandard steel to save money. You altered records to cover it up. And you justified it all for a quarterly bonus. Is that what you call a judgment call? The room was a pressure cooker, the tension threatening to burst. Outside, workers had gathered near the trailer, drawn by the raised voices leaking through an open window. Tyrell stood at the front, his arms crossed, listening as Ethan's defense unraveled. Rose's eyes flicked to the window, her heart racing. The truth was spilling out, and it wasn't just Ethan's career on the line, it was the safety of every worker on the site. Thomas turned to the auditor. What's the risk assessment? He asked. The auditor flipped to a new slide, a diagram of the Northeast Foundation marked with red stress points. The slope misalignment has caused level 1 cracks, she said. If unaddressed, localized settlement is likely within 6 weeks. The building's integrity is at risk. A collective gasp ran through the room. Daniel Harper cursed under his breath, his notebook falling to the table. Aaron Langley's face went pale, his hands trembling. Ethan sank into his chair, his tie askew, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. Thomas stepped closer, his voice dropping to a chilling calm. The scariest part, Mr. Caldwell, he said, isn't that you insulted me this morning. It's that if I were just a laborer, you'd still think dismissing warnings, falsifying reports, and endangering lives was acceptable. You didn't fail because you lacked knowledge. You failed because you believed no one beneath you had anything to teach you. Ethan's head dropped, sweat beading on his forehead. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The trailer felt like a courtroom, and Thomas was both judge and jury. Outside, the workers' whispers grew louder, their faces pressed against the window. Tyrell clenched his fists, his voice low as he muttered to a coworker. Caldwell's done. Malik Hayes, whatever his name is, he's got him. Thomas turned to the team, his gaze sweeping over each face. This isn't just about one man, he said. It's about a system that lets arrogance fester, that silences the people who see the truth. I built Eaglestone to be different. Today we start fixing what's broken. He nodded to the auditor, who began distributing copies of the audit report, each page marked with red ink signatures, timestamps, undeniable proof. Ethan stared at the document in front of him, his hands shaking. The trailer door creaked open and Henry Brooks, the 56-year-old site supervisor, stepped inside. His weathered face was calm, but his eyes held a spark of recognition as he looked at Thomas. Knew it was you, Henry said, his voice rough but warm. That look in your eyes, same as when we mixed cement in Brooklyn. Should have said something sooner, Mr. Hayes. Thomas allowed a faint smile, the first since his arrival. If I'd told you, Henry, how would I know who's worth keeping, he said. You've always seen the truth. That's why you're still here. Henry nodded, then turned to Ethan, his gaze hardening. You should have listened to him this morning, Caldwell. Might have saved yourself. Ethan's face crumpled, the last of his defiance crumbling. The trailer was a crucible, and he was melting under the heat of his own choices. Thomas closed his folder, the sound sharp in the silence. We're not done, he said. In 15 minutes, I want the entire technical team in here with every foundation analysis, material record, and drawing from the past 3 months. We're rebuilding this project from the ground up. He turned and walked out, the trailer door swinging shut behind him. Ethan remained in his chair, a statue of a man whose world had just collapsed. Outside, the workers parted as Thomas stepped into the sunlight, their whispers following him like a tide. The site was still, the crane silent, the air heavy with the promise of change. Thomas Malik Thompson Hayes had torn the mask off Eaglestone's flaws, and the reckoning was just beginning. The Eaglestone construction site was a powder keg, and the spark had just been struck. The midday sun beat down on the Atlanta lot, turning the air into a shimmering haze that clung to the workers' sweat-soaked clothes. The trailer where Thomas Malik Thompson Hayes had just dismantled Ethan Caldwell's career stood like a fortress at the edge of the site, its steel walls reflecting the heat. But outside the ground was shifting. Workers clustered in small groups, their voices a low, angry hum. The whispers from the morning scaffold incident and the meeting's confrontation had grown into a roar, fueled by the revelation that Malik, the quiet laborer they'd known for weeks, was Thomas Malik Thompson Hayes, the founder and CEO of Eaglestone Constructions. Tyrell, the 35-year-old machinist with a scar across his eyebrow, stood at the center of the growing crowd, his arms crossed and his eyes blazing. His work gloves were tucked into his belt, and his voice carried over the din of the site. "We're done playing nice," he said, his deep baritone cutting through the chatter. "Caldwell's been risking our lives for months, bad steel, shaky foundations, and now we find out he's been lying? And Malik, Mr. Hayes called it from day one. We're not lifting another beam until someone listens." Rosa, the petite warehouse supervisor, nodded fiercely, her dark hair escaping its bun as she held up a makeshift sign scrawled on a piece of cardboard. "Listen to us. I've been saying it for weeks," she said, her voice trembling with conviction. "The material logs don't add up. We're short on rebar and the cement's been diluted. Caldwell didn't query, just wanted his bonus." Luis, the young mason who'd nearly fallen from the scaffold that morning, clutched a second sign, "No more risks." His hands still shook, but his jaw was set. "Malik saved my life today," he said, his voice cracking. "If he says the foundation's bad, I believe him. We're not pawns for some suit to play with." The crowd swelled, workers abandoning their posts to join the impromptu protest. Cranes stood idle, their operators leaning out to watch. The site, usually a symphony of drills and shouts, fell eerily quiet, the only sound the rustle of boots on gravel and the growing chant, "No more lies. No more lies." The protest wasn't organized, but it was raw, born of years of being ignored, of warnings dismissed, of lives treated as expendable. In a city like Atlanta, where construction was a lifeline for many, the stakes were personal. These were men and women who'd built skyscrapers with their hands, who knew every crack in the concrete, and who were done being silenced. Inside the trailer, Ethan Caldwell sat hunched in his chair, his tie loosened, his face pale as the audit reports lay scattered before him. The weight of Thomas's words, "You failed because you believed no one beneath you had anything to teach you," pressed down like a physical force. Daniel Harper, the senior structural engineer, stared at the floor, his guilt a knot in his chest. Aaron Langley, the foundation supervisor, clutched a pen, his knuckles white. Jared, Ethan's assistant, stood frozen by the door, his tablet forgotten. The air was thick, the silence broken only by the rising chant outside. Thomas stood at the head of the table, his dark blue suit immaculate, his silver-rimmed glasses glinting under the fluorescent lights. His presence was a quiet storm, commanding without effort. He'd just closed his briefcase when the chant reached his ears, a rhythmic pulse that vibrated through the trailer's walls. He turned to the window, his sharp eyes taking in the crowd, dozens of workers, their signs raised, their faces set with defiance. Tyrell stood at the front, his voice leading the chant. Rosa's sign caught the sunlight, its message a demand for justice. Thomas's lips twitched, not in a smile but in recognition. This was what he'd come for, not just to expose Ethan, but to see if the heart of Eaglestone still beat with the values he'd founded it on. The trailer door burst open, and Ethan flinched as Henry Brooks, the 56-year-old site supervisor, stormed in. Henry's weathered face was flushed, his graying hair damp with sweat. His work boots left dusty prints on the linoleum, and his voice was rough with urgency. "You've got a problem, Hayes," he said, addressing Thomas directly. "The workers are shutting down the site. They're not moving until you come out and talk." Ethan shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly. "This is insubordination," he snapped, his voice hoarse. "Get out there and order them back to work, Brooks. Now." Henry didn't even glance at Ethan. His eyes were locked on Thomas, a spark of understanding passing between them. "They're not listening to me, Caldwell," Henry said, his tone flat. "And they sure as hell ain't listening to you. Not after what just happened in here." He paused, then added, "I knew it was you, Hayes. That look in your eyes, same as when we mixed cement in Brooklyn. Should have said something weeks ago." Thomas's expression softened, a rare warmth in his gaze. "You saw what I needed you to see, Henry," he said. "That's enough." Ethan's face twisted with desperation. "This is my site," he shouted, stepping toward Henry. "I'm still the chief engineer. Get those workers back to their posts or I'll—" "Enough," Thomas said, his voice low but cutting through Ethan's outburst like a blade. He turned to Ethan, his eyes cold. "You've lost their trust, Mr. Caldwell. You don't get to give orders anymore." Ethan froze, his hands trembling. The chant outside grew louder, the words "no more lies," echoing like a heartbeat. Thomas turned to the team, his voice steady. "Stay here," he said. "We'll reconvene after I address the crew." He nodded to Henry, who opened the door and stepped out into the blinding sunlight. The crowd fell silent as Thomas emerged, their signs still raised, their faces a mix of anger and hope. He climbed onto a makeshift platform, 2 steel frames stacked together, the same spot where Foreman gave daily briefings. No microphone, no podium, just a man in a suit standing before a sea of workers in hard hats and dust-stained clothes. Tyrell crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing as he waited. Rosa gripped her sign tighter, her heart pounding. Luis stood beside her, his young face set with determination. The workers stretched across the concrete yard, their shadows long in the afternoon light. Thomas scanned the crowd, his gaze lingering on familiar faces. He saw Tyrell, whose sharp instincts had fixed a miscalibrated valve last week, only to be dismissed by Ethan. He saw Rosa, who'd caught discrepancies in the material logs but was told to stay in her lane. He saw Luis, whose life he'd saved that morning, a reminder of why he'd come here in the first place. These were the hands that built Eaglestone, the voices he'd vowed to hear when he started the company 2 decades ago. And now they were demanding to be heard. "Good afternoon," Thomas began, his voice deep and clear, carrying across the yard like the strike of a hammer. "For those who don't know me, I'm Thomas Malik Thompson Hayes, founder and chairman of Eaglestone Constructions." A ripple of gasps and murmurs ran through the crowd. Workers exchanged stunned looks, their signs lowering slightly. "That's Malik," one whispered. "The guy who poured concrete with us," another said, his voice thick with disbelief. Tyrell's grin widened, his scar catching the light. Rosa's eyes glistened, a mix of pride and relief. "For the past 4 weeks," Thomas continued, "I've worked among you as Malik Thompson. No title, no office, no name. I carried a shovel, mixed mortar, and listened to the hum of this site from the ground up. I wanted to see if the values I built this company on, trust, respect, and truth, still hold. I've seen your strength, your grit, your refusal to break under pressure. But I've also seen silence born of fear, and arrogance from those who forgot they were once workers like you." The crowd was still, the only sound the faint whistle of wind through the crane's cables. Thomas's eyes found Ethan, who'd stumbled out of the trailer, his face pale as he stood at the edge of the crowd. "Today," Thomas said, his voice rising, "I'm here to confirm that Ethan Caldwell, the chief engineer of this project, is no longer with Eaglestone Constructions due to serious ethical and technical violations." A wave of sound erupted, gasps, cheers, and scattered applause. Tyrell pumped a fist, his voice booming, "About time." Rosa's sign shook in her hands, her lips trembling with a smile. Luis clapped, his young face alight with vindication. Ethan flinched, his shoulders hunching as if the crowd's reaction was a physical blow. Jared hovered behind him, his tablet clutched like a shield. Thomas raised a hand, and the crowd quieted. "This isn't about tearing anyone down," he said. "It's about rebuilding. I've heard your frustrations about materials that don't meet spec, about warnings ignored, about a culture that values bonuses over lives. That ends today." He paused, letting the word sink in. The workers leaned forward, hanging on his every syllable. "Starting next week," Thomas said, "Eaglestone will launch the Voice from the Ground program. Every worker, engineer, and staff member will have the right to report technical risks directly to the Executive Safety Board, no supervisor required. If your proposal is viable, you'll be rewarded as equals to the design team." The crowd roared, applause breaking out like thunder. Tyrell clapped Luis on the back, his grin fierce. Rosa's sign dropped to her side, her eyes shining with hope. Even the crane operators high above joined in, their cheers echoing across the site. Thomas's voice cut through the noise, unwavering. "We're also expanding our free technical training for underprivileged youth, for those society has overlooked. The instructors won't be professors or executives. They'll be people who've fallen and learned to rise, people who know the cost of arrogance." His eyes flicked to Ethan, who stood frozen, his face a mask of shame. The crowd followed Thomas's gaze, their cheers fading to a heavy silence. Ethan's tie hung loose, his shirt untucked, his polished shoes scuffed with dust. He was no longer the chief engineer, just a man exposed by his own choices. Thomas stepped down from the platform, his suit jacket fluttering in the breeze. "I'm not here to shout slogans," he said, his voice softening but no less powerful. "I'm here to prove that when you speak, someone will listen. Starting with me." The applause returned, louder, fiercer, a wave of sound that shook the yard. Workers raised their signs again, their faces alight with something new, not just relief, but pride. They were seen, heard, valued. Tyrell led a new chant, "Voice from the ground. Voice from the ground." Rosa joined in, her voice cracking with emotion. Luis pumped his fist, his fear replaced by fire. Henry Brooks approached Thomas, his weathered face creased with a half-smile. "You stirred the pot good, Hayes," he said, his voice low. "They're ready to follow you anywhere now." Thomas nodded, his eyes still on the crowd. "They're not following me, Henry," he said. "They're leading themselves. That's what I came to see." Behind them, Ethan turned and walked toward the trailer, his steps low, his shoulders bowed. No one jeered, no one mocked, but their eyes followed him, a silent judgment more piercing than words. The site was no longer his. It belonged to the workers, to the truth, to the man who'd walked among them as one of their own. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the concrete, Thomas stood among the workers, shaking hands, listening to their stories. He didn't need a suit or a title to command respect, earned it with every shovel of dirt, every warning he'd voiced, every life he'd protected. Eaglestone Tower would rise, but its true foundation was being poured right here in the voices of those who'd been silenced for too long. The Eaglestone construction site was cloaked in the amber glow of late afternoon, the Atlanta skyline softening as the sun dipped toward the horizon. The air was still heavy with dust and the faint hum of idling machinery, but the energy of the site had shifted. The workers' chants had faded, replaced by a quiet resolve as they dispersed, their signs tucked away, their voices now carried by Thomas Malik Thompson Hayes' promise of change. The trailer, once a battlefield where Ethan Caldwell's career had crumbled, stood silent, its steel walls reflecting the dying light. Inside, Ethan sat alone, his tie discarded, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if it could anchor him to a world that no longer existed. The audit reports lay scattered before him, their red-marked pages a damning testament to his choices: falsified inspections, substandard steel, ignored warnings. Each document was a brick in the wall of his arrogance, now collapsed under the weight of Thomas's judgment. Ethan's blue eyes, once sharp with confidence, were dull, staring at the two sheets of paper Thomas had left him. The first was a termination letter, outlining charges of fraud and endangerment that would strip him of his engineering license and end his career. The second was a voluntary resignation agreement, paired with a 6-month commitment to teach at Eaglestone's Technical Training Center for underprivileged youth. No salary, no title, just a chance to rebuild what he'd broken. 5 minutes. That's how long Thomas had given him to choose. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly, each second a hammer strike against Ethan's pride. Outside, Thomas stood among the workers, shaking hands, listening to their stories. His dark blue suit was slightly creased now, his silver-rimmed glasses catching the light as he nodded at Rosa's suggestion to audit the supply chain. Tyrell clapped him on the shoulder, his scar twitching as he grinned. Luis, still shaken from the scaffold incident, thanked him quietly, his voice thick with gratitude. Thomas's presence was a beacon, drawing the crew together in a way Ethan never had. But his mind was partly on the trailer, on the man whose fate hung in the balance. He'd seen men like Ethan before, bright, ambitious, blinded by their own egos. The question wasn't whether Ethan would fall, but whether he'd choose to rise. Inside, Ethan's hands trembled as he picked up the termination letter. The words blurred: civil lawsuit, professional misconduct, loss of license. His life flashed before him, the Stanford degree he'd framed with pride, the Buckhead condo with its skyline view, the bonuses that had padded his bank account. All of it, built on a foundation of shortcuts and silenced voices, now crumbling. He thought of his wife, Claire, who'd left last year after one too many late nights at the office. He thought of his daughter, Sophie, who barely called anymore, her college tuition still unpaid. The trailer door creaked open and Jared stepped inside, his tablet clutched like a lifeline. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, his voice hesitant. "Mr. Hayes wants your decision." Ethan didn't look up. "Get out," he said, his voice low, broken. Jared hesitated, then slipped away, the door clicking shut. Ethan's eyes fell to the resignation agreement, the words Technical Training Center staring back at him. He thought of Malik Thomas standing in that meeting, his calm unshaken by Ethan's venom. He thought of the scaffold, the crack he'd ignored, the life he'd nearly cost. For the first time, he saw himself clearly, a man who'd climbed a tower of ego, only to find it hollow. He picked up a pen, his hand shaking, and signed the resignation agreement. The ink felt like blood, but it was also a release, a surrender to something he couldn't yet name. Outside, the workers had mostly returned to their posts, the site humming back to life. Thomas stood by the main gate, speaking with Henry Brooks, the 56-year-old site supervisor whose weathered face held a quiet pride. "He's still in there," Henry said, nodding toward the trailer. "What do you think he'll do?" Thomas adjusted his glasses, his eyes thoughtful. "He'll choose," he said. "The question is whether he'll learn." As the words left his mouth, Ethan emerged from the trailer, a small cardboard box in his arms, his framed degree, a coffee mug, a few files. His shirt was untucked, his face pale, but his steps were steady. The workers paused, their eyes following him, not with contempt but with a heavy silence. Ethan didn't meet their gazes. He walked toward the parking lot, his box a meager relic of his former life. Thomas watched him go, then turned to Henry. "I'll be in the lot," he said. "Keep the team ready for the next meeting." Henry nodded, his half-smile knowing. "You're giving him one last chance, aren't you?" Thomas didn't answer, just walked toward the parking lot, his suit jacket catching the breeze. Ethan had reached his sleek black SUV, tossing the box into the back seat. He was about to climb in when Thomas's voice stopped him. "Mr. Caldwell." Ethan froze, his hand on the door. He turned, his face a mix of defiance and dread. Thomas stood a few feet away, his posture relaxed but his eyes piercing. "What do you want?" Ethan asked, his voice hoarse. "You got what you came for." "I'm done." Thomas stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "You think this was about destroying you?" he said. "I didn't come here to set you up, Caldwell. I came to see if my company still stands for what I built it on. You made your choices, but you're not the only one who failed today." Ethan's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists. "Don't lecture me," he snapped. "You played me pretending to be some nobody, letting me dig my own grave. You think I don't know what this is? You wanted a scapegoat, and I'm it. Now I'm out of a job, my savings are gone, and my daughter's tuition is due next month. You happy?" Thomas's expression didn't change, but his eyes softened, a flicker of empathy beneath the steel. "I know what it's like to lose everything," he said. 20 years ago I was a laborer on a site like this, no degree, no prospects. A foreman told me I'd never be more than a pair of hands. I proved him wrong not by tearing him down, but by building something better. You've got a chance to do the same." Ethan laughed, a bitter sound that echoed in the empty lot. "A chance? Teaching kids for free while I lose my house? That's not a chance, Hayes. That's a sentence." Thomas took another step, closing the distance. "It's a choice," he said. "You can walk away, fight the lawsuit, lose everything. Or you can show up at that training center and teach those kids what you're still good at. You're not defined by your mistakes, Caldwell. You're defined by what you do next." Ethan's eyes glistened, his throat tight. He wanted to scream, to blame Thomas, to cling to the anger that had fueled him for years. But the truth was heavier than his pride. He thought of Sophie, her last text asking for money he didn't have. He thought of the scaffold, the crack he'd ignored, the lives he'd endangered. For the first time he felt the weight of his choices, not as a victim, but as a man who'd lost his way. "You don't get it," Ethan said, his voice breaking. "I'm ruined. Everything I built, it's gone." Thomas's gaze held steady. "Then start over," he said. "Not with titles or bonuses, but with something real. Those kids need someone who's been where they are, who's fallen and gotten up. You can be that person, or you can be nothing. Your call." Ethan stared at him, the words sinking in like water into dry earth. He opened his mouth to argue, but no words came. Thomas turned and walked away, his silhouette sharp against the fading light. Ethan stood alone, the SUV's door still open, the box of his old life waiting in the back seat. He didn't move for a long time, the weight of the moment pressing down until he felt he might break. 6 months later, the Woodrow Technical Training Center stood in a quiet corner of Atlanta's northern suburbs, its faded green walls and cracked pavement, a stark contrast to the gleaming Eaglestone Tower rising downtown. The center was no palace, just a cluster of low buildings surrounded by chain-link fences, serving kids from temporary housing, from families who'd never dreamed of college or careers in construction. But inside Classroom 4B, something was taking root. Ethan Caldwell stood at a chalkboard, a ruler in his hand, sketching a foundation pressure diagram. His expensive suits were gone, replaced by a faded flannel shirt and khaki pants, his blonde hair slightly longer, his face lined with a new kind of weariness, not defeat, but effort. The classroom was small, its desks scratched, its walls lined with posters of bridges and blueprints. A dozen students, mostly teenagers, sat before him, boys in oversized hoodies, girls with notebooks clutched tight, their eyes fixed on the board. If you look at the soil composition here, Ethan said, pointing to the diagram, you'll see why the foundation needs extra reinforcement. It's not just theory, it's what keeps a building standing when the ground shifts. His voice was steady, patient, a far cry from the sharp bark he'd used on the Eaglestone site. He paused, watching a student named Terrence, a lanky 16-year-old with a quick mind, sketch the diagram in his notebook. Good, Terrence, Ethan said. Now what happens if we ignore the clay content? Terrence hesitated, then raised a hand. It'll settle unevenly, he said. The building could crack, maybe collapse. Ethan nodded, a faint smile breaking through. Exactly. Never skip the soil test, no matter how tight the schedule. He moved to the next student, a girl named Myra, who was struggling with her sketch. Here, he said, kneeling beside her desk. Angle the beams like this. It distributes the load better. Myra, 17, with braided hair and a shy smile, nodded, her pencil moving with more confidence. Thanks, Mr. Caldwell, she said, her voice soft but earnest. Ethan stood, his eyes sweeping the room. These kids weren't engineers, not yet, but they were hungry for knowledge, for a chance, for someone to believe in them. He'd been skeptical when he started, expecting resentment or apathy. Instead, he found focus, questions, even gratitude. It was humbling and it hurt, because it reminded him of all the workers he'd dismissed, all the voices he'd silenced. Outside the classroom window, Thomas Malik Thompson Hayes stood with arms crossed, watching silently. Beside him was Daniel Harper, the senior structural engineer, now overseeing Eaglestone's training programs. Daniel's graying beard twitched as he nodded. He's good with them, he said, half surprised. Didn't think he had it in him. Thomas's eyes stayed on Ethan, who was now helping Terrence adjust a measuring tool. He didn't, Thomas said. Not 6 months ago. But he asked me one question before he started. If I do this right, will anyone trust me again? Daniel raised an eyebrow. And you believe he's earned it? Thomas's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile. It's not about trust, he said. It's about giving him a chance to rebuild his foundation. If he keeps showing up, he'll earn it himself. Inside, Ethan packed up a model foundation after the students finished a compression test. Myra raised her hand, her voice tentative. Mr. Caldwell, she said. If you made a mistake on a big project, did anyone give you a chance to fix it? The room went quiet, all eyes on Ethan. He set the model down, his throat tightening. The question cut deeper than Myra could know. He thought of the scaffold, the audit, the moment he'd signed his resignation. No one gave me a chance, he said, his voice steady but raw. I had to take it. And I learned you don't erase mistakes, you fix them, piece by piece, like a cracked foundation. Myra nodded, her eyes bright with understanding. The other students watched, their silence not judgment but respect. Ethan cleared his throat, forcing a smile. All right, let's wrap up. Homework's on the board. As the students filed out, Daniel knocked on the door. Break time, Caldwell, he said, his tone light but warm. Ethan looked up, his eyes meeting Thomas's through the window. For a moment, neither man moved, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. 15 more minutes, Ethan said. The kids are finishing a test. Daniel grinned, turning to Thomas. He's not the same guy, he said. Thomas nodded, his gaze lingering on Ethan. Hope's in the work, he said. Not the title. 3 months later, Ethan received 3 job offers: a project coordinator role in Texas, a technical manager position in Denver, and a lucrative gig with a multinational in Chicago. He turned them all down, not because he doubted his skills, but because he wasn't done. Terrence was mastering sectioning, Myra was excelling at slump testing, and a dozen other kids were starting to see futures they'd never imagined. Ethan remembered their names, their quirks, their dreams. He'd spent years chasing titles, but here, in a cramped classroom with a chalkboard and a handful of students, he found something he'd never had: purpose. In a quiet moment, as he packed up after class, Ethan looked at the board, his diagram still there. He thought of Thomas, of the man who'd given him a choice when he deserved none. He thought of the workers he'd ignored, the lives he'd risked. The guilt was still there, a shadow he'd carry forever, but it was lighter now, softened by the work, by the chance to make it right. Ethan Caldwell wasn't the chief engineer anymore. He was something but airman learning to build again, not with steel, but with trust. The Eaglestone Tower stood complete, a 30-story colossus of glass and steel that gleamed in the heart of Atlanta's financial district. Its sleek facade caught the soft afternoon light, reflecting the city's skyline like a mirror held to the future. Inside, the lobby was a marvel of modern design, polished marble floors, soaring ceilings, and walls adorned with plaques listing international partners. But what stopped visitors wasn't the grandeur. It was a gold-plated sign mounted on a white marble backdrop, its words etched in bold, unyielding letters. We build with materials, but we rise with respect. Every morning at 6:45 a.m., Thomas Malik Thompson Hayes, 39, walked past that sign, his step steady, his dark eyes lingering on the words. It wasn't pride that stirred in his chest, but a reminder of the workers who'd been silenced, of the man he'd been as Malik Thompson, of the company he'd fought to save. 6 months had passed since the seismic day at the Eaglestone construction site, when Thomas revealed his identity as the founder and CEO, toppling Ethan Caldwell's reign and igniting a rebellion among the workers. The ripples of that day had spread far beyond the dusty lot, reshaping Eaglestone Constructions and the industry it served. The Voice from the Ground program, launched in the wake of Thomas's speech, had transformed the company's culture. Workers, from laborers to engineers, now reported technical risks directly to an executive safety board, bypassing supervisors who might dismiss them. Proposals deemed viable earned rewards equal to those of the design team, leveling a hierarchy that had long favored titles over truth. The results were staggering. Safety incidents dropped by 78%, delayed reports vanished, and the site buzzed with a new energy. Workers like Tyrell, the machinist with the scarred eyebrow, no longer hesitated to flag issues, his voice now as valued as any engineer's. Rosa, the warehouse supervisor, led a team auditing supply chains, her meticulous logs catching discrepancies that saved millions. Luis, the young mason, enrolled in Eaglestone's technical training program, his near miss with the scaffold fueling his drive to learn. The changes didn't stop at the site. Thomas's reforms caught the attention of the construction industry, a world often mired in bureaucracy and corner-cutting. Invitations poured in for him to speak at conferences, from local seminars in Georgia to international summits in Chicago and London. Representatives from rival firms visited Atlanta, notebooks in hand, eager to study Eaglestone's model. Some offered to buy the rights to the Voice from the Ground program, waiving contracts with seven-figure sums. Thomas declined every offer, his voice firm at a national construction conference. Trust isn't built with contracts. It's planted, nurtured, and grown, like a foundation that cracks if you rush the pour. His words, broadcast on industry podcasts, became a mantra for a new generation of builders, a call to prioritize people over profit. At Eaglestone's headquarters, a photograph now hung in the main lobby, replacing the old display of executive portraits. It showed a worker in a stained jacket pointing to a blueprint, a young engineer listening intently beside him. Beneath it, a simple caption read, "Knowing less doesn't mean not knowing what's right." The image wasn't just decor, it was a declaration, a reminder that the company's strength lay in its workers, not its boardroom. Thomas passed it daily, his suit jacket slung over his shoulder, his old Nokia phone still in his pocket. He hadn't changed his habits, still arriving before dawn, still walking the sites as he had as a laborer. But his vision had grown, fueled by the belief that a company could be more than a machine, it could be a movement. The 30th floor of Eaglestone Tower, once reserved for elite meetings, was now a community mentorship room, its glass walls lined with sketches from the Mentorship from the Ground program. Here, trainees from underprivileged backgrounds, kids like those Ethan Caldwell now taught, presented ideas, critiqued policies, and learned the craft of construction. One afternoon, Rosa stood at a whiteboard, explaining supply chain logistics to a group of teens, her voice confident, her eyes alight. Tyrell, now a site trainer, demonstrated welding techniques, his scarred hands steady as he guided a nervous student. Luis, balancing night classes with his apprenticeship, sketched a foundation design, his pencil moving with the precision he'd honed under pressure. The room was a living testament to Thomas's promise, that every voice mattered, that every hand could build. Ethan Caldwell, 43, was part of that promise, though he'd never expected to be. At the Woodrow Technical Training Center, he stood in classroom 4B, a chalkboard behind him, a ruler in his hand. His flannel shirt was rolled to the elbows, his khaki pants creased from a long day. The arrogance that had defined him as Eaglestone's chief engineer was gone, replaced by a quiet focus, a patience he'd learned through failure. His student scenes from Atlanta's toughest neighborhood sat at scratched desks, their notebooks open, their eyes fixed on him. Terrence, the lanky 16-year-old with a knack for math, was mastering structural analysis. Myra, the 17-year-old with braided hair, had just aced a slump test, her shy smile brighter each day. Ethan knew their names, their struggles, their dreams. He'd spent years ignoring the workers beneath him, but here, he listened, corrected gently, explained again when needed. "Remember," Ethan said, pointing to a diagram of a beam, "load distribution is everything. Miss it, and the whole structure's at risk." He paused, catching Terrence's raised hand. "Go ahead." "What if the blueprint's wrong?" Terrence asked, his voice curious but firm. "Like, what if the engineer messes up?" The question hit Ethan like a punch, stirring memories of the Eaglestone site, the scaffold, the audit. He set the ruler down, his throat tight. "If the blueprint's wrong," he said, "you speak up. Doesn't matter who's in charge. A mistake ignored is a disaster waiting." He looked at Myra, who nodded, her pencil poised. "And if they don't listen," he added, "you keep speaking until they do." The students scribbled notes, their trust in Ethan palpable. He wasn't just a teacher, was proof that failure wasn't the end, that a man could fall and still stand. Outside, Thomas watched through the classroom window, his arms crossed, his dark eyes thoughtful. Beside him stood Daniel Harper, the 56-year-old engineer now leading Eaglestone's training initiatives. "He's found his place," Daniel said, his beard twitching with a smile. "Didn't think he'd last a month." Thomas adjusted his glasses, his gaze on Ethan as he helped Myra adjust a measuring tool. "He didn't think so either," he said. "But he showed up. That's where it starts." Inside, the class ended and the students packed up, their chatter filling the room. Myra lingered, her notebook clutched to her chest. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "you ever think about going back to big projects? Like, running sites again?" Ethan paused, the question stirring a pang of longing. He'd received offers, lucrative roles in Texas, Denver, Chicago. He could have taken them, rebuilt his career, reclaimed the life he'd lost. But he thought of Terrence's quick mind, Myra's growing confidence, the dozen other kids who looked to him not as a title, but as a guide. "Maybe one day," he said, his voice soft. "But right now, I'm where I need to be." Myra smiled, then hurried out, leaving Ethan alone. He erased the chalkboard, the dust settling on his hands, a reminder of the site he'd left behind. The guilt was still there, a shadow he'd carry forever, but it was lighter now, softened by the work, by the chance to make things right. He thought of Thomas, of the man who'd seen something in him worth saving. He thought of the workers he'd dismissed, the lives he'd risked. The chalkboard was clean now, a blank slate, and for the first time, Ethan felt he could write something new. At Eaglestone's headquarters, Thomas stood before a special board meeting, his voice steady as he outlined the next phase of reforms. The room was packed, executives, engineers, team leaders, even workers like Rosa and Tyrell invited as equals. "We've seen what happens when arrogance goes unchecked," Thomas said, his eyes sweeping the room. "But we've also seen what's possible when every voice is heard. Starting today, every employee has the right to flag issues without fear, with feedback guaranteed within 48 hours. Whispers of approval rippled through the room. Rosa nodded, her notepad filled with ideas for the supply chain. Tyrell leaned back, his arms crossed, a proud grin on his face. Thomas continued, announcing an expansion of the mentorship from the ground program, pairing trainees with instructors like Ethan, people who'd learned from failure. "We're not just building towers," he said. "We're building a generation that knows their worth, not by degrees, but by what they create." The meeting ended with applause, not formal but genuine, a sound that echoed the workers' cheers from 6 months ago. Thomas stepped into the hall, where a new plaque had been installed beside the mentorship room. "The strongest structure isn't built with steel. It's built with respect." He touched it lightly, his fingers tracing the words. It wasn't a trophy, it was a vow, a commitment to the workers he'd walked among, to the company he'd nearly lost, to the man he'd always be. Down in the Eaglestone Tower lobby, a group of interns gathered for a surveying lesson, led by Ethan, now a senior instructor. A girl with graphite-smudged hands, her hair tied back, raised a question. "Mr. Caldwell, what if you're right, but the boss is wrong? How do you make them listen?" Ethan picked up a pebble from the ground, holding it up. "This isn't on any blueprint," he said. "But if it's in the wrong spot, it can throw everything off. Speak up kindly, clearly, but speak." 'Cause if you don't, you're not just failing the project. You're failing yourself. The interns nodded, their eyes bright with possibility. Ethan looked out at the lobby, at the sign that defined Eaglestone's new era. He wasn't the man he'd been, and neither was the company. It was a culture now, a promise that no one would be silenced, that no one would fall without a hand to lift them up. Thomas, watching from the 30th floor, saw it too, not just a tower, but a legacy built not on steel, but on the belief that people could change, that foundations could be poured again. The story of Eaglestone wasn't just about a tower or man's redemption. It was about the courage to listen, to rebuild, to trust that even the deepest cracks could hold something new. As the sun set over Atlanta, casting golden light across the city, one question lingered. If you were Thomas, would you have given Ethan a second chance? The answer wasn't in the steel or the glass, but in the hearts of those who kept building, brick by brick, towards something better. Alright, folks, let's take a breather from the steel beams and concrete dust of Eaglestone Tower and talk about what this wild ride means for us in 2025. Picture this. You're scrolling through your endless work emails, dodging your boss's Zoom calls, and maybe just maybe ignoring that one coworker who's got a better idea, but no fancy title. Sound familiar? Thomas Malik Thompson Hayes and Ethan Caldwell's story isn't just a construction site soap opera. It's a neon sign flashing, listen up, or your life's foundation might crack. The big lesson here? Humility isn't just for yoga retreats, it's the rebar that keeps your career, your relationships, and your sanity standing tall. Ethan thought he was the king of the site, but one snarky comment to the wrong laborer sent his ego crashing harder than a bad TikTok dance. Meanwhile, Thomas, the undercover CEO, showed us that real power isn't in a corner office seats, in hearing the quiet voices, whether they're in a boardroom or break room. In today's world, where we're all shouting into the social media void, maybe it's time to pause and ask, who's the Malik in your life you're overlooking? That intern with the quirky idea? The barista who knows your order by heart? Heck, maybe it's your dog giving you that look when you skip their walk. Point is, everyone's got something to teach, and ignoring them is like pouring concrete on quicksand, messy and expensive. Now let's get real. If you were Thomas, would you have tossed Ethan a lifeline or let him sink in his own arrogance? And be honest, have you ever been an Ethan, too proud to listen, or Malik, quietly waiting for your moment? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We're dying to hear your take. Oh, and before you go back to doom scrolling, hit that subscribe button to catch more stories that'll make you laugh, think, and maybe rethink that snarky email you're drafting. Because here at Channel Name, we're not just building towers, we're rebuilding better humans, one story at a time. So what's your next move? Listen, or keep swinging that ego hammer.